Welcome back to the deep dive. I wanted to start today with, well, with the question that's maybe a little bit abstract, but I promise it lands somewhere very real for you listening.
Okay, I'm ready.
When you think of a battlefield, what do you actually see?
Usually, I mean, trenches, right? Tanks and mud,
Right.
soldiers.
Right. Physical space. But today we're actually talking about a completely different kind of terrain. We are going into the battlefield of memory.
Which honestly is often way more dangerous.
Yeah.
Because the casualties there aren't just people, they are the truth itself.
Exactly. I mean, we usually think of history as this static thing, right? Like it's a fossil in a museum, this happened and then that happened, end of story.
Right.
But what if history is active? What if it's something that can be manipulated or twisted or even erased while it's literally happening?
It happens a lot more often than we'd like to admit. History is written by the victors, as the old cliche goes, but
Yeah.
in the modern age, it's not just written by the victors.
Right.
It's actively curated by the powerful.
And that leads us to the really heavy question we are grappling with today. What happens when a government doesn't just fight a people physically, with guns and prisons, but fights to rewrite their reality?
Right.
When they use the entire machinery of the state newspapers and radio and intelligence agencies and diplomacy to turn a specific community into a villain in the eyes of the entire world.
And importantly, not just within their own borders. That is the key distinction for today's deep dive. We are looking at how a narrative manufactured in one country can be exported and packaged and sold to another country halfway across the world.
Yeah, we are doing a forensic dismantling of a propaganda machine.
Yeah.
And we aren't just speculating here either. We actually have a smoking gun document for this.
We do.
It's a paper from 1996 titled The Persecution of Sikhs Indian Propaganda on Canadian Soil.
A really chilling title. And 1996 is such a pivotal year to be looking back at that previous decade.
Yeah, the author is Anne E. Louthian, and she wasn't writing this from some ivory tower. She was completely in the trenches.
Right. She served as the executive director of the World Sikh Organization of Canada.
The WSO.
Exactly. The WSO from the 1990s right up to early 2001.
So she was witnessing this distortion of reality in real time. She was seeing exactly how the narrative about Sikhs in Canada was being manipulated by forces way outside of Canada.
Yeah, she saw the mechanics of it up close.
But before we even open the pages of her report, I think we need to talk about where we found it, because honestly, the where is just as important as the what.
Absolutely.
This document comes from a massive and vital collection known as the Sikh National Archives, or SNSC, pronounced SNAC.
SNA, yeah.
And discovering SNSC was a bit of a revelation for me. It's not just a library. It feels more like a bunker, a fortress.
A fortress of memory. And we really have to pause here and give credit to the architect of that fortress, Ajit Singh Sahota.
Yes, tell me about him, because you don't just wake up one day and decide to build a massive national archive.
No, you really don't. It takes a very specific kind of visionary obsession. Ajit Singh Sahota understood decades ago something that most of us are only just realizing now in our digital age.
Which is what?
He understood that paper is incredibly fragile. He realized that if a community doesn't preserve its own documents, its own government papers and rare books and pamphlets, then someone else is going to write their history for them.
And they probably aren't going to write it kindly.
Precisely. He spent decades doing relentless research, writing and collecting things that others might have literally thrown in the trash. He saw the value in the ephemeral stuff, the scraps of paper that actually prove what happened.
So in a way, SNSC is really about sovereignty.
Preservation is sovereignty. That's the core tagline, really. If documents like Anne Lothian's paper aren't preserved by community archives like SNSC, then the official government narrative is the only story left standing.
The one backed by armies and PR firms.
Exactly.
That is a terrifying thought. The idea that the truth essentially evaporates if you don't catch it and put it in a box. So today, thanks to SNAC and the incredibly hard work of Ajit Singh Sahota, we have this paper. Let's actually open it up.
Let's do it.
So Lothian starts by pulling back the curtain on the actual psychology of hate. She doesn't just say, oh, people were mean. She breaks down the mechanical structure of it. And she starts with the concept called the halo effect.
Right.
Now, I took Psych 101. So I know the halo effect is usually a good thing.
Usually, yes, it's a positive cognitive bias. Let's say you meet someone at a party. They're really well dressed. They have a nice smile. They speak clearly.
Right.
Your brain, being lazy, takes a shortcut. It says, oh, this person looks good, so they must be good. You assume they are smart and kind and honest just based on that first positive impression.
You give them a halo.
You give them a halo.
Okay, so how does a government weaponize a cognitive shortcut against a whole community?
They completely invert it. Lothian argues the Indian government created what you might call a horns effect.
A horns effect.
Yeah, they took a population of over 20 million Sikhs, a community with a 500-year history of service and equality and this distinct theology, and they focused the media camera lens exclusively on a tiny, tiny fraction of individuals involved in unrest.
Or, as the source points out later, unrest that was entirely manufactured.
Exactly. By flooding the media with these negative images, angry men, weapons violence, they created a new cognitive shortcut for the public.
They wanted the world to see a turban and immediately think terrorist.
That is exactly it. They wanted to strip away the nuance of millions of everyday lives and replace it with a single, scary caricature.
She calls this political attitudinal theory, which honestly sounds very dry and academic, but when you actually break down what it means, it's quite sinister.
It is deeply sinister. It's the idea that the state has the power to set the absolute definitions of reality. The government decides what is true, and they establish what Lothian refers to as a party feeling.
Party feeling. That sounds like something straight out of 1984, the George Orwell book, not the year.
Very Orwellian. The idea is that to be a quote-unquote good citizen, you have to share the feelings of the state. You must love what the state loves, and you must absolutely hate what the state hates.
Right.
In this context, the propaganda was designed to create a nationalist fervor, where being Indian was strictly defined.
Defined how exactly?
Defined by the majority. The narrative being pushed was that to be a true Indian, you had to fit a very specific mold. And if you asserted a distinct identity like the Sikhs were doing, saying, hey, we are a sovereign faith, we are distinct, then you weren't just culturally different, you were a traitor.
You were an enemy of the state.
Yes.
Lothian actually quotes a specific slogan that was being pushed heavily around this time, Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan.
Right, that slogan is the core of what she calls integrative propaganda. It's a very dangerous triad.
Unpack that triad for us. Hindi, Hindustan.
It basically means to live in Hindustan, India, you must speak Hindi and you must be culturally Hindu.
It's an attempt to assimilate everyone under one giant blanket identity. But wait, India is massive. It has hundreds of languages and dozens of religions.
Exactly. But this specific propaganda tries to erase all of that diversity. And for Sikhs, this is an existential threat. You have to remember, Sikhism was founded explicitly on distinct principles. It is monotheistic. It completely rejects the caste system. It fundamentally believes in the equality of all humanity.
So telling a Sikh, hey, you're actually just a version of a Hindu, isn't a compliment.
It's an insult. It's sacrilegious. It's like telling someone, I love you so much, I'm going to pretend you're actually me. It completely denies their existence.
And Lothian points out that when Sikhs pushed back against this, when they simply said, no, we are distinct, the state didn't say, okay, let the talk about it.
No, they said, you are separatists. You are dangerous.
Lothian goes even further in the text. I mean, she doesn't pull any punches here. She actively compares this Indian state propaganda to Soviet agitation models and even the Nazi campaigns of the 1930s.
That is a very heavy comparison.
It is. Usually when people bring up the Nazis, the argument loses all its nuance. But she's incredibly specific about why she makes that link.
She is. She argues the core goal was total uniformity. In the 1930s, the enemy was difference itself. The state needed a scapegoat to unify the majority.
Right.
If you can make the majority feel terrified of a minority, you can control the majority. Lothian actually quotes literature from that time in India that said, our enemy is everywhere in Hindustan, even in its leaves.
Even in its leaves. That gives me chills. That is paranoia manufactured on a national scale.
It creates a total siege mentality. It makes the average citizen feel like they're constantly under threat.
And once the majority feels under siege, the government can basically justify anything in the name of quote-unquote security.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the event that really kicked this propaganda machine into overdrive. We really have to talk about 1984.
June 1984, yes.
Now, I want to pause here for a second on the language, because if you read a standard history book, or if you just quickly look at Wikipedia, you'll see this event referred to as Operation Blue Star. But in Lothian's paper, and broadly in the Sikh community, those words are never used.
No, and for very good reason. Operation Blue Star is a military code name. It sounds sterile. Clinical.
Yeah, it frames the event as a necessarily surgical procedure.
Exactly.
So what should we be calling it?
The community refers to it as the Saka Akal Takht Sahib, or the Battle of Amritsar,
Why that distinction, though? Why is that important?
because words define reality. Saka Akal Takht Sahib refers to the actual target of the attack. The Akal Takht is the supreme seat of temporal authority for Sikhs. It sits right across from the Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple.
Right.
By using that name, you are explicitly acknowledging that this was an attack on the religious and political center of an entire people. It frames it correctly as a historical assault, not just some routine police action.
Right. And Lothian describes the lead up to this attack as a, quote, Soviet-style media blackout. And looking at the details, blackout really feels like an understatement.
It was a total severance of information, and this is honestly one of the most damning pieces of evidence for premeditation. On June 3rd, 1984, the state of Punjab was effectively cut off from the entire world.
A total curfew was imposed, right?
Yes. They kicked out the foreign press completely.
Even Mark Tully, the famous BBC correspondent.
Right. He had been covering India for years, and he was forced out. Now you have to ask yourself, why kick out the press if you're just going in to flush out militants, as the official story went?
Usually if you're the good guys, you want cameras there to show the world you being the good guys.
Exactly. You kick out the press so you can totally control the narrative. If there are no cameras and no independent witnesses, then the only truth available is whatever the Army press release writer types up.
Lothian argues the government wanted to ensure that when the violence started, they held the pen.
They wanted absolute narrative control.
And the violence reading through the source material, it wasn't just against people. This is the part that really stuck with me. It was a battle against culture itself.
The destruction of heritage. This connects so powerfully back to why SNSC exists in the first place. The Army didn't just attack the complex. They intentionally burned the Sikh reference library.
Describe what was actually in there for us.
We are talking about completely irreplaceable history, scriptures and manuscripts dating all the way back to the 14th century. Handwritten documents by the gurus themselves.
Wow.
Paintings, artifacts. Basically, the collective memory of the Sikh people was in that library.
And the source says they were sought out?
That is the crucial phrase, yes. Sought out and destroyed. It implies direct intent. You don't accidentally burn a specific library during a chaotic firefight if your goal is just to capture a few guys.
Right.
You burn a library if you're actively trying to erase a people's memory. You burn a library if you want to make absolutely sure that future generations don't know who they are.
That is just devastating. It's like a cultural lobotomy.
It is. And that is exactly why what Ajit Singh Sahota and the entire team at SNSC are doing by digitizing these surviving documents is not just some historical hobby.
Right.
It is an act of defiance. It is an act of survival. Every single document they scan is a document that can't be burned. They are actively rebuilding the library that was lost.
That really raises the stakes of what we're talking about. An archive isn't just a dusty room. It's a shield.
A digital fortress.
Yeah, but going back to June 1984, because the press was locked out, the official story became the only story. And the numbers they give, the numbers just don't add up at all.
Not even close. The government released an official casualty figure of 493.
493, yes.
Yes, and they deliberately lumped civilians and quote-unquote terrorists together to muddy the waters.
Right.
But independent reports from groups like Citizens for Democracy, who actually went in afterwards, they estimate the dead in the thousands.
Lothian calls it a massacre of innocence.
She points out a crucial fact that often gets ignored. June 4th wasn't just a random Tuesday. It was a holy day, a specific martyrdom day.
So the complex was totally full.
It was full of pilgrims. We're talking about families from rural villages, old men, women, little children, thousands of them.
And the government knew this.
They meticulously planned the attack for this specific day. They knew the complex would be at maximum capacity.
That is a chilling detail that just conveniently gets left out of the official narrative.
Always.
And then, after the guns went silent, came what the source calls the black propaganda. Now, I'd never heard this specific term used before reading this paper.
Black propaganda is a very specific intelligence technique. It's when you deliberately fabricate lies that are so sensational and so dirty that they immediately dominate the front pages.
Even if you know you'll have to retract them later.
Even if you quietly retract them later, yes. The initial shock is all that matters.
Give us an example of this from the text.
Well, Lothian lists these horrific stories about drugs and prostitutes being found inside the Golden Temple complex.
Which, if you know literally anything about the Golden Temple,
It's completely absurd. It is the holiest site in Sikhism. Tobacco and alcohol are strictly forbidden. The mere idea of vice in that sacred space is utterly unthinkable to a Sikh.
But these stories were printed on the front pages of major Indian newspapers anyway.
Yes.
Why? What's the goal of a lie that obvious?
To break the halo we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
to humiliate them globally. If you can convince the rest of India that these quote-unquote deeply religious people were actually just drug addicts and pimps, you completely destroy their moral high ground.
You make the army look like they were, quote-unquote, cleaning up filth rather than attacking a holy shrine.
Precisely.
And did they ever correct the record on those stories?
For sure. Weeks later, in tiny print, hidden away on the back pages. But by then, the damage is done. The image is already planted in the public's mind.
And speaking of images, they really weaponized the visual identity of the Sikh, didn't they?
They absolutely did. TV screens all across the country were suddenly flooded with images of angry turbaned men. The state media would deliberately cut together old, unrelated footage of Sikhs fighting in historical wars or at unrelated protests to suggest this violent propensity.
They were building a character profile for the whole world to see, the Sikh as the natural aggressor.
Right.
And this is where the story actually moves to Canada, because that manufactured image didn't just stay in Punjab, it was aggressively exported.
This is really the absolute crux of Lothian's entire paper. It's titled Indian Propaganda on Canadian Soil for a Reason. She argues heavily that the Indian government viewed the Canadian Sikh diaspora not just as people who left, but as a major ongoing threat.
But why? I mean, they're halfway across the world. Why would the government care what a guy living in Vancouver thinks about local Indian politics?
Because they were free. They were completely outside the state censorship bubble.
Oh.
They could tell the world what was actually happening back in Punjab. They could lobby Western politicians. They could raise money for human rights groups.
So they were a leak in the information blackout.
Exactly. So the Indian government decided they had to be discredited too. Canada became what the source calls a soft target.
And this introduces one of the most shocking elements of the entire source text. I honestly had to reread this part multiple times because it sounded like something out of a bad spy thriller. The third agency.
It really does read like dark fiction, but it's completely in the historical record. The third agency was a top secret organization created to operate entirely outside the normal military and police command structures.
And their job was effectively to act as agents provocateurs, right?
False flag operations, yes. And their primary tool on the ground was a group known as the Black Cats.
The Black Cats. Just the name itself sounds incredibly ominous. Explain who or what the Black Cats actually were.
These were often police and army personnel or sometimes just hired criminals who were deliberately dressed up to look exactly like Sikhs.
Dressed up like they were wearing costumes.
Literally, yes. They wore turbans, they grew out their beards, they adopted all the traditional visual markers of the Sikh faith, and then they went out into the rural villages of Punjab and committed horrific crimes.
Wait, so they
robbed families, they killed people,
Yeah.
They just totally terrorized the local population.
So that the locals and, more importantly, the world media would look at this and say, look, the Sikhs are terrorists.
That's precisely. It was a psychological operation designed to sow total confusion and turn the everyday people against the freedom movement.
Right. If a family is terrorized in the middle of the night by men wearing turbans, they might start to deeply fear the very people who are fighting for their rights.
Exactly. It retroactively justifies the brutal crackdowns. If the population is utterly terrified of quote-unquote Sikh terrorists, they might actually welcome the army coming in to, quote, save them.
That is just diabolical. It's state-sponsored gaslighting on a lethal scale.
It is.
And Lothian argues this tactic didn't just stay in those rural villages. She outlines that Indian intelligence agencies were heavily active right here in Canada, trying to stir up trouble to make Canadian Sikhs look dangerous to their own neighbors.
And the real tragedy, according to Lothian, is that the Canadian government basically let it happen. She is incredibly critical of the Canadian response at the time.
She uses the specific phrase, Canadian complicity, which is a very heavy charge to level at your own government.
It is, but she backs it up methodically.
Mm-hmm.
She takes that political attitudinal theory and applies it directly to Canada. She asks a very hard question. Why did Canadian officials just accept Indian intelligence reports completely, without question?
Right.
Why did the RCMP and CSIS rely so heavily on information provided by the exact same government that was actively persecuting these people?
It seems incredibly naive in hindsight, or do you think it was willful ignorance?
Lothian suggests it was mostly about money, realpolitik, trade relations. India is a massive global market, a, quote, Commonwealth partner. She argues very clearly that economic interests simply trumped human rights. The Canadian government did not want to rock the boat with a major trading partner over a minority diaspora community.
There's a really disturbing detail in the text about bounty hunters.
Yes. This is one of the things Canadian Sikhs were desperately trying to tell the government about. Back in Punjab, the police were literally giving cash bounties for turbaned heads.
Wait, literally, a financial incentive to kill young Sikh men?
Yes, a literal bounty system.
So you could make a living just hunting people?
Yes, you could. And Lothian notes that these police officers were granted total state impunity. They simply couldn't be prosecuted for these murders.
And when Canadian Sikhs tried to raise the alarm about this in Ottawa, about the bounties and the extrajudicial killings, they were largely dismissed as fanatics here in Canada.
Because the propaganda had worked beautifully. The Canadian officials saw a Sikh advocate and immediately thought troublemaker, not victim.
Exactly. We really have to talk about the Air India tragedy now, because it's the elephant in the room whenever we talk about this specific era in Canadian history. It's the worst mass murder in Canadian history. Lothian addresses it directly, doesn't she?
She does, and she heavily references the book Soft Target and several other analytical reports. Her argument, based strictly on the source material, is that there was a massive, coordinated disinformation campaign surrounding the bombing.
She mentions specific warnings that were ignored by authorities.
She points to the fact that Indian officials actually canceled their own tickets on that specific flight.
Wait, really? The source definitively says that.
That is exactly what the source states, that officials and their family members canceled their reservations very shortly before the bombing occurred. Lothian uses this to discuss a concept she calls diplomatic immunity for propaganda.
What does that mean in this context?
She argues that Indian intelligence officials were able to feed deliberate false leads to the RCMP and to CSIS to completely steer the Canadian investigation.
Toward what end?
The overarching goal was to completely discredit the entire Sikh community in the eyes of the West. If you can pin a tragedy of that immense magnitude on the community as a whole, you effectively delegitimize them forever.
So effectively using a horrifying tragedy to permanently silence a diaspora.
To delegitimize is the exact word she uses. Because if you can permanently stick the terrorist label on Canadian Sikhs, then no one in the international community will ever listen to them when they try to talk about the ongoing human rights abuses in Punjab.
And it worked, didn't it? For decades, the Sikh community in Canada has basically been on the defensive.
Always. Always having to prove a negative.
I am not a terrorist.
Exactly. Imagine having to start every single conversation with your neighbor or your coworker by actively proving you aren't a violent extremist. That is the crushing burden this propaganda created.
Which naturally brings us to part 4 of our deep dive, the actual human cost of all this. Because while this high-level propaganda war was happening in the newspapers and in diplomatic cables, real people were suffering horrifically on the ground.
Specifically, November 1984.
The pogroms.
Yes.
This was immediately following the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi.
The dark slogan raised by the mobs, and actively supported by state officials, was blood for blood.
Lothian makes a very careful distinction here. She describes it not as a riot, but explicitly as a state-sponsored pogrom. What is the functional difference there?
A riot implies spontaneous chaotic anger, an unorganized outburst of violence.
Right.
This was highly organized. Mobs were transported in government-owned buses. They were handed literal lists of Sikh homes and businesses lists that came directly from official voter rolls.
So they knew exactly where to go.
Yes, and they were systematically given kerosene and weapons.
There is a really haunting detail in the text about the radio broadcasts during this time.
Yes. This really drives home the total state control aspect we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Victims described looking out their windows and seeing burning bodies in the streets. Absolute unimaginable horror. But while this was happening right in front of them, the state-run radio was just playing normal, everyday programming.
There's music and weather.
Or alien commentaries that had absolutely nothing to do with the reality on the streets.
It completely highlights that terrifying disconnect.
Yeah.
The state media was erasing the violence in real time as it was happening. If it's not on the radio, the state is saying it's not actually happening.
And we simply can't talk about the erasure of violence without talking about Jaswant Singh Kalra.
A true hero of the truth.
Truly. Jaswant Singh Kalra wasn't a militant. He wasn't some radical politician. He was a researcher, an actuary, actually. He worked at a bank. He understood how numbers work.
And he found the numbers that just didn't make any sense?
Exactly. He started looking closely at the cremation grounds across Punjab. He uncovered hard evidence that the police had been actively abducting young Sikh men,
Right.
killing them in fake quote-unquote encounters, and then secretly cremating their bodies as unidentified.
So nobody means no crime.
That was the logic. But Kalra looked at the municipal firewood receipts. He looked at the daily logs, and he meticulously documented over 25,000 illegal cremations.
25,000. That is a staggering number to wrap your head around. That's an entire stadium full of people just gone.
It is literally genocide by attrition.
Yeah.
And because he had the courage to expose this, because he actually traveled to Canada and spoke publicly about it, in fact, he spoke directly at the WSO, which was Lothian's organization.
Right.
Because of that, he became a marked man.
But he still went back to Punjab.
He did. And the police took him. He was, quote-unquote, disappeared. He was never seen again.
Lothian uses his specific case in the paper to illustrate what she calls the legacy of abuses.
Yes. She points out that these, quote-unquote, Punjab solutions, the torture, the disappearances, the forced silence, they didn't end in Punjab. They became a state blueprint.
A blueprint for what?
The Indian government later utilized the exact same brutal tactics in Kashmir and other conflict zones. If a state gets away with it once, they simply do it again.
So the forced silence wasn't just about covering up crimes in the past. It was about actively enabling crimes in the future.
Exactly. Immunity breeds further violence.
I really want to touch on something Lothian mentions regarding the diaspora's psychological reaction to all this trauma. She talks specifically about massacre art.
Yes, this is a fascinating part of her analysis.
She describes these vivid paintings depicting the torture, the bodies at the Golden Temple. Now, I think for an average outsider walking into a Canadian Gurdwara and suddenly seeing a massive painting of a man being boiled alive or shot, it's shocking, right? It looks inherently violent.
It is incredibly visceral, and the state propaganda would immediately point to that and say, look, see, they worship violence. Look at their bloody art.
But Lothian reframes it so beautifully in the paper. She says it's absolutely not a celebration of violence. It is a, quote, witness that will not allow one to rest.
It's proof.
It's proof, exactly.
It is saying this actually happened to us. In a world where the government media is constantly broadcasting that nothing happened, it was just a few terrorists and everything is perfectly normal, hanging, that painting on the wall is a profound act of resistance.
It says, we remember, and you cannot gaslight us.
Precisely.
And that ongoing struggle to simply remember translates directly to the everyday life of Canadian Sikhs even today. Lothian talks at length about the turban cases and the fights over the Legion halls.
The daily struggle against the terrorist label. Sikhs in Canada had to spend millions of dollars and decades of community energy just defending their basic right to exist in public spaces.
To wear a turban while serving in the RCMP?
Or to just walk into a local Royal Canadian Legion Hall.
It seems almost petty in comparison to the mass killings we just talked about, but it's actually part of the exact same war, isn't it?
It is. Lothian argues that all of this was made infinitely harder because of the imported propaganda.
Because the average Canadian had been subconsciously fed this media diet of Sikh equals dangerous?
Right, so every single minor cultural dispute instantly became a high-stakes battle for national security in the public imagination.
It really paints a vivid picture of a community under intense siege from two sides at once. The very real physical threat to their families back home and the exhausting reputational threat here in their new home.
And that is exactly why Anne Lothian's paper is such a crucial historical document. It explicitly connects those two worlds. It documents the actual mechanical blueprint of the lie.
So let's try to bring this all together now. We have covered the psychological theory of erasure, the brutal physical events of 1984, the deliberate export of that false narrative to Canada, and the immense human toll it took on the diaspora.
At its core, it is a massive, incredibly well-funded state attempt to completely erase a community's truth. That is the bottom line.
And this brings us right back to the start of our deep dive, to the real hero of our conversation today. Not just the paper itself, but the archive where it actually lives.
The Sikh National Archives, SNAC.
Think about it. This incredibly detailed paper we just spent an hour dissecting, it explicitly documents the attempt to destroy history. But if this paper just sits in a damp basement somewhere, or gets thrown out in a dumpster when someone moves house, that counter-narrative totally disappears.
And the government story wins by default.
Exactly.
That is why the ongoing work of Ajit Singh Sahota is just So visionary, he literally saw this coming. He realized that paper is incredibly fragile. Human memory is fragile.
But the archive is a shield.
And SNSC is the digital fortress protecting it.
It is. And it's not just for university academics or researchers like you. It's for everyone.
Absolutely everyone.
So if I'm listening to this and I go to the website, what am I actually seeing in there?
You are seeing everything. We are talking about incredibly rare books that you literally can't find anywhere else on Earth. Government documents that were supposed to remain top secret forever. High-resolution photographs of events that the media blackout desperately tried to hide from the world. Audio and video testimonies of the actual people who lived through the horror.
It's the real story, the completely uncensored version of reality.
It is the raw, unvarnished material of truth. And it is sitting there waiting for researchers, for university students, for local educators. But most importantly, it is there for the Sikh community itself to reclaim its narrative.
Don't let your history gather dust. That's the core message here.
It really is. And here's the truly incredible part. They actually want your help to build it. If you are listening to this right now and you happen to have a dusty box of old papers from your grandfather in the attic, or old community magazines from the 80s or handwritten letters, do not throw them away.
SNIC will digitize them for you,
It's no
right?
charge, completely free. They're actively inviting the entire community to be a vital part of this preservation effort. Because as we established at the beginning, preservation is sovereignty.
So here is your concrete call to action for today. Whether you are a historical researcher, a curious student, or just someone who deeply cares about the preservation of truth, go to sikhnationalarchives.com.
Yes, please go.
Explore the collection. It is absolutely mind-blowing what they have managed to save.
And honestly, if you have the means, please donate. This is a massive nonprofit effort. It takes real resources to carefully scan, to securely host, and to permanently preserve these delicate documents. Every single dollar goes toward keeping the truth safe from erasure.
Sikhnationalarchives.com. Go there. See it for yourself.
You know, Lowalthian's paper actually starts with a really beautiful quote from Guru Nanak.
Truth is the highest virtue, but higher still is truthful living.
Yes. We've talked a whole lot about the truth today, the cold hard facts, the casualty numbers, the dates, but truthful living. I think in this specific context, truthful living really means having the active courage to protect that truth.
To not let it be quietly erased by the powerful.
Exactly. To make absolutely sure that the next generation actually knows what happened to their parents and grandparents.
That is an incredibly powerful place to leave it. The archive isn't just a graveyard for the past. It's the foundation for the future.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over today. If a government is willing to spend millions of dollars and decades of effort to erase the history of just one community in 1984, what parts of our own modern history are being quietly rewritten right in front of us right now simply because we aren't taking the time to archive the truth?
That's a question we all need to answer.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's been a heavy one, but a deeply important one. Go check out SNSC at sikhnationalarchives.com. Keep learning, keep archiving, and we'll see you next time.
Sat Sri Akal.
Goodbye, everyone.